Well, hopefully you found that interesting. The idea that all babies are born with the capability to pronounce and to distinguish, to understand any phoneme, and that they slowly lose it over the first year of their life based on what language they're exposed to. Really an important thing for all of us to know, that our brains are designed to figure out the language that we're surrounded by. And so as we get older and older, and so of course I wouldn't call a 1-year-old old, but by the time you have passed through puberty and your brain has really become pretty much your adult form, so by your mid-20s, you're going to have a lot of difficulty acquiring a new language and having the correct phonemes and things like that, because your brain has gotten really designed for your primary language. I mean, that's what your brain was intended to do, was to figure out your primary language. Now, a little bit bigger basic unit would be morphemes. Okay, so we already established that EME means unit. Morph means body. So the word morpheme refers to the body, or the smallest units that can carry any meaning in a language. I'm using English as our example, since theoretically we all speak that. So morphemes would constitute like the root words, any prefixes that you would put on a root word, any suffixes that you would put on a root word. So let's go back to our word psychology. If we break this down into morphemes, we really have two. We have psych, which is mental, I think. And then we have ology, which means the study of. My geese are honking on my Audubon clock. I always feel bad because if you're distractible and you're hearing that in the background, you're like, oh, there's that noise again. So I always like to identify it for you so you don't have to just be distracted or annoyed by it. You might ask, why don't I just turn it off? But I have long ago forgotten how you do that. So our morphemes are much different from a syllable. You learn syllables as part of, your English training or whatever, and you would break down the word psychology differently if you were doing it by syllables. What we're doing is breaking it into the units, the smallest units that carry any meaning. So if we were going to break the word morphemes down into its basic morphemes, we would have the word morph, which I told you means body. We would have the little suffix "eme," which I told you means unit, and then we have the S, which means it's plural. Right? So morphemes can be as small as a single letter, all the way up to some words only mean what they mean in their entirety, right? Like you can't break it down into smaller parts. So let's talk a little bit about some higher levels of linguistic analysis. This is going to be talking about, instead of just individual words only, we can expand out to phrases or whole prose passages, or sometimes, like an entire work, like an entire book, you can distill it down to its basic meaning, right? Like, what is this really about? Some people are really good at that. They can read an entire book and they can tell you, like in one sentence, really what it was about. I'm horrible at it. So I'm like, well, let me tell you, in chapter 1, there was this. Maybe that's why I'm a teacher. I'm great at like retelling to you what I've distilled down, but it's as long as the original work. So this higher levels, we're going to be talking about entire words, entire phrases, or entire prose passages, or entire works. Grammar governs these higher levels of linguistic analysis. Grammar would be the syntax, the ordering of words within a sentence. Really, grammar means rules, the rules for the language. So syntax is one component of grammar. How you order the words within a sentence, how you conjugate verbs is another good example, or how you conjugate plurals or superlatives. Those are all examples of syntax. Semantics, on the other hand, is the other major group of grammar rules. And these would be the rules that we all follow for deriving meaning from language. So as we are receiving spoken language, we all are operating under the same basic rules for figuring out what the speaker's talking about. And that's why almost always we walk away having heard the same basic message. We may have imposed some top-down processing onto it as we were remembering it, right? And so we may not have everything perfectly the same, but we heard what they said in the same way. Let's talk a little bit about semantics and how these rules are used and stuff, why we need these rules. For one thing, we need rules for deriving meaning because there are two types of structure in language. There's the surface structure, which would be the words that the speaker is actually using. And then there's the deep structure, which would be the meaning underlying the words. And those two things might match or they might not. And so we need semantic rules to figure out what does the person mean when in fact the deep structure doesn't match the surface structure. Let me give you some examples of different types of links between surface structure and deep structure. So in the synonymous type, the deep structure and the surface structure match. So Bill kissed Jane and Jane was kissed by Bill mean the same thing, right? The surface structure may look different, right? Bill kissed Jane looks on the surface different from Jane was kissed by Bill, but the deep structure in both of those sentences is the same. And so you have to know all of the words in the sentence. You have to be able to understand the words in the sentence. You have to realize that the first one, Bill kissed Jane, that's just in the active voice. So we're just telling you which actor did what verb to which recipient, right? And whereas the second one is what we call the passive voice. So we've got what recipient had what done to by which actor, right? So it's in the reverse order. But you probably can read those two and know that those actually mean the same exact thing. So in a synonymous setup, the surface structure differs, but the deep structure matches. In ambiguous setups, like this one, visiting relatives can be a nuisance. Visiting relatives can be a nuisance. Okay, maybe some commas would help us to decide what we mean. Because do we mean that going to visit relatives can be a nuisance? Or do we mean having relatives come to visit can be a nuisance? Either one of those is a viable interpretation of that same sentence, right? So in this one, the surface structure matches, but the deep structure differs. So we're going to have to rely on some other cues, some other semantic cues to figure out what does this speaker mean in this exact context, right? Because it could be that the speaker is saying, you know, boy, it's a nuisance for me to get packed up, take my family and go visit relatives. Or the speaker could be meaning, boy, it's hard getting the house all clean and ready because the visiting relatives are going to be here, right? You need some clues to help you figure that out. So I just thought I'd show you a video that's going to illustrate what part of the brain really is necessary for understanding that synonymous structure, where you've got the same meaning, but it can be phrased different ways. It turns out that you have areas of your brain that are specifically designed for picking up this kind of surface structure and what it really means. And if you have damage to that part, it's called Wernicke's area. If you have damage to that part, you're not going to be able to see those two examples as actually having the same deep structure. It will mean something different to you if you have damage to that area. So go ahead and watch this. It's kind of an older piece, and there have been some newer versions of sort of talking about BROCA'S and WERNICKE'S area, but I swear there's nothing better than, I have never seen anything better than this depiction of this guy showing his deficit. And also the guy who's talking to him, Geschwind, was like the father of figuring out the roles of BROCA'S and WERNICKE'S area. So you can't beat having like the most famous guy interviewing this guy who has this deficit. So that's why you're going to watch kind of an old movie. So here you go.